So the second universal session of the Synod, called the Synod on Synodality, is the 16th Synod of Bishops in the recent history of the Church. Took place in Rome from the 2nd to the 27th of October 2024, this year. You would have been familiar with the fact that it was happening at least. And like the first session, it was held in the Vatican Audience Hall rather than in the usual Synodal Hall. The reason for that was that the Audience Hall is larger and it is differently structured so that people can sit around tables and they can sit around in small groups. And that's where most of the Synodal Assembly was conducted. Among the 368 participants, many of them, of course, were bishops, but there were a significant number, over 80, religious and laity, men and women. And one novelty that continued from the first session was they all had voting rights. They were all able to vote the final document. The Assembly adopted the method that it had used in the first session of conversations in the Spirit. Now, you might be wondering, what the heck is that? Well, it is where groups of 10, around 36 tables, gather together and share, listen to one another, share, spend moments in silence and in prayer, and come gradually to a consensus or an agreement. It's a kind of not that new a method in a way for religious or for people like us, societies of apostolic life. But I think we wouldn't, it would be less spiritual in our communities than this was. This was strong spiritual content and facilitated too by Timothy Radcliffe, a Dominican, who spoke several times to the Synodal Assembly. Many of his talks are published, so you can look at them on the website, on the Synodal website. This novel method, by all accounts, worked quite smoothly this time around. There were hiccups during the first session, but not this time, because the vast majority of the participants were quite familiar with it. So it went quite smoothly. The Synod concluded with the approval of a rather large document of 52 pages. I don't have it here. Well, I have it here on this, but I don't have it in paper. I don't want to waste paper. I'm into conserving paper as much as possible. And it's entitled, the title of the document is For a Synodal Church, Communion, Participation, Mission. It contains 155 paragraphs. That's a big number when you think of it, of paragraphs. And all of those paragraphs were voted separately. Now, before they were voted, there were about 2,000 amendments made to the document. So you can imagine the people who were helping and drafting the document and preparing it, how hard they worked. In fact, they were up all night for several nights. Maybe that's why the document is so crazy. Sorry, no, I take that back. So all the paragraphs received a 2/3 majority. Now, there were a few of the paragraphs was close enough, not very close, it was well over, but paragraph 60, and I'll come to it later, got the most no votes of any paragraph in the Synod, and I'll explain why later, but we leave that for the moment. Immediately that the document was finished and Pope Francis was concluding the Synod, the Synodal Assembly, he approved it for publication, saying that he would not be releasing a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which is the type of papal document that usually follows a synod. and many of you here would know that. So this document then becomes part of the ordinary papal magisterium, declared as such by Pope Francis in a note that he made at the end. Now, the unifying theme of the document, you have an outline there and the structure of it. The document consists of 5 parts with an introduction and a conclusion. Very short conclusion, a little bit longer introduction. The unifying theme overall is the call to conversion. The first part, entitled The Heart of Synodality, explains the call to synodal conversion, also explains what synodality means and what it involves. The focus of the second part, which is entitled On the Boat Together, you say, well, that must be about fishing. Well, it's not actually, but it borrows the symbol or the fishing references in Scripture. It's about the conversion of relationships within the church. It's all about relationships. Part 3 is entitled Cast the Net, including the kind of the fishing image, focuses on conversion of the processes of governance in the church, all about governance, discernment, decision-making, and accountability. The focus of part 4, which is entitled An Abundant Catch, is on the conversion of bonds, B-O-N-D-S. Now, that's not money within the church, but it is what unites us and what keeps us together in unity as a community of Christ's disciples. And the 5th part is focused on formation for missionary discipleship. Now, just a brief word about the introduction. The introduction situates the document in the context of the 3-year journey of worldwide consultation that took place and which we were part of, thanks be to God. It also refers to the continuing work of the 10 study groups and 2 commissions established following the first universal session. Now, the work of these groups will continue until June next year. Now, there are several topics, and I have a list of them that are that are being studied and for which there will a report will be issued and reported and presented. Mission in the digital environment is one. Mission in the context of the digital transformation. Seminary reform. Questions relating to ministries, including the possibility of a diaconate for women. The relations between bishops and religious orders, the role of nuncios, and there are more than that. And then there were 2 special commissions. One of them will be of interest to some of you here. That is accompaniment of those in polygamous marriages. That's with specific reference to Africa. And then the reform of canon law. Just there's no harm to mention that. The conclusion states that the synodal church, it's a very short conclusion, is meant to give witness to and be an instrument of communion for all peoples. And that universality of the work of the Synod is stressed many times by the Pope in this concluding homily as well. And some of you would be aware of that. And it ends with a prayer entrusting the results of the Synod to Mary, the Mother of God. So we come to part 1, the heart of synodality, called by the Holy Spirit to conversion. The document affirms that synodality is a constitutive dimension of the church as a missionary community of Christ's disciples. Now, you'll remember that that word was used before in regard to justice. There was a document produced on justice which said justice is a constitutive part of the proclamation of the gospel. Now, synodality is a constitutive part of what the church is, so it can't be overlooked. The purpose of synodality is to make the church truly visible as the people of God, working together to proclaim by word and by deed the gospel of Christ. So its orientation is to mission. And Pope Francis has stressed that many times before this document was published. Synodality is described, and I wanted to quote the exact words here because I think they're very important, as the path of spiritual renewal and structural reform. So it does apply to structures that enables the church to be more participatory and missionary so that it can walk with every man and woman, radiating the light of Christ. That's in paragraph 28. That's an important statement, it seems to me. Now, synodality involves obviously gatherings at all levels of the church, from the local to the universal, for mutual listening, dialogue, and communal discernment. Now, the word communal discernment occurs many times in the course of the document. And it requires certain dispositions which all of us don't have, but we could cultivate. For example, humility. It's good to cultivate that one. Patience. And willingness to forgive. Now, they're mentioned in paragraph 43. But I would also mention faith. We all have that, certainly. Courage and trust. They're important. Now, realizing that the unity of the church does not mean uniformity. It doesn't mean everybody doing the same thing everywhere in the world. The document states that the appreciation of different contexts, cultures, and diversity, and of the relationships between them is a key to growing as a missionary synodal church. In other words, not all the changes of structure will happen equally in every church at the same time. Without losing unity, that diversity will be respected. The document also states that in accord with the post-Vatican II emphasis on the importance of dialogue with other religious traditions, the church strives together with them to build a better world. Embedding synodality in the heart of the church requires accompaniment and formation, not only of laymen and women, not only of the laity, but also of the clergy and religious. And that's repeated many times actually in the document, the need for accompaniment and formation. The question that came to my mind constantly as I read this was, who is going to do this? You can't ask very old people to do that work. They're not able. But clearly it is seen as vitally important to the success of the synodal journey of the church. Now, the second part is on the boat together. All of you have been on a boat, I think. And you know, the interesting thing about a boat is you have to trust your neighbor because otherwise it could overturn. Yeah, so it's a good image actually. And people have to do different things on a boat to keep it sailing. Under this heading, the document develops the implications of synodality for all relationships in the church. It endorses the call for greater inclusivity and the cultivation of what it calls an ecclesial culture where all members are made to feel welcome, irrespective of marital status, identity, or sexual orientation. Now that's an important paragraph. That's paragraph 58. Why is it important? Because many people, including Mary McAleese, said there was no reference to LGBT. But the words are not used. But to say there's no reference to LGBT is wrong, because that includes LGBT persons. It is clear that they're included, and Pope Francis himself, in the homily he gave at the end of the synod, highlights this theme of inclusion. He stated that the church must be a visible sign, an instrument of God's kingdom, presented by Jesus, he said, as a great banquet for all peoples. Hence, insists Pope Francis, the church must always be opening doors instead of erecting walls. And he goes on to add, we should never be erecting walls. I think he's getting a dig at Trump there, yeah. The foundation of the fundamental equality of all persons in the church is their common baptism. And, you know, many, many times the sacramental basis for synodality is to be seen in baptism, by which we are all made equal. We're all children of God, sons and daughters of God. And this necessitates a much greater participation of lay women and men in the life and mission of the church. By the way, there were far more women in the Synodal Assembly with voting rights than there were men. But maybe that's because they depended on of course, an invitation from the Pope. So there must be greater participation in all aspects of the life and mission of the church, including its decision-making processes at all levels, from local churches to the universal. The document acknowledges the need for new forms of lay ministry, both institutional, that's institutional forms that are recognized and created by the church, and non-institutional forums, which may vary according to the needs of local churches. It calls for a special ministry of listening and accompaniment for those alienated from the church, like Mary McAleese, you know. So you don't condemn her, you reach out to her and try to talk to her and to listen to her anger and understand it. So that's what we try to do. The document also highlights the need for greater co-responsibility between clergy and laity. Now, an important addition here in the document is, and it's in number 70, adding that there must be a distinction between what properly belongs to ordained ministry and what can and should be delegated to others. Now, in fact, in practice, many priests are doing things that has nothing to do with the fact that they're ordained. Nothing whatsoever, and that lay people could well do. So it's stressing that, and that's very true. The document also calls for the laity to be given a greater voice in the election of bishops. I didn't know that they had any voice to make it greater or less. I thought that they were completely ignored, as well as most priests being ignored in the election of bishops. Some priests are consulted, but most ignored. Now we come to an important paragraph, 60. This deals specifically with the issue of women's participation in the life and mission of the church. And it begins by acknowledging, and I want to quote the words it says, women continue to encounter obstacles in obtaining a fuller recognition of their charisms, vocation, and roles in all the various areas of church life. Now, I add in my own note here, some of these obstacles are church-made regulations rather than the will of God or the teaching of Jesus. So the obstacles are coming not from outside the church, but from within the church and from some people high up in the church. The document adds that there is no reason, and I quote the words, no reason or impediment that should prevent women from carrying out leadership roles in the church. What comes from the Spirit cannot be stopped. Now that is certainly comforting for women to hear, that they can. And Pope Francis has tried to get them into leadership positions. As you know, there are quite a number of leadership positions in the Curia that are given to women, including one member, lay woman, lay sister, I think, not lay, sorry, sister, who is head of the congregation for the laity. Contrary to what we had been led to expect, the document states that the question of women's access to diaconal ministry remains open. Remains open. They're the words I'm quoting. And this is one of the issues currently being examined by Group 5 of the special study groups. And we will have a report on that in June next year. Now, part 3 is entitled Cast the Net, the Conversion of Processes. Now, under this heading, the document focuses on the principles and processes of ecclesial discernment, decision-making, and accountability in the church. These practices, it states, are closely intertwined. Can't separate them. Decision-making processes need ecclesial discernment. Often, of course, in the past, anyhow, the only person who discerned was the bishop himself and maybe his close friend or whatever, together. And this discernment requires listening in a climate of trust that is supported by transparency and accountability. Can't be hiding things, it must be open. Trust must be mutual. Now, this is an important point, because I don't think that there is much trust in the church, actually. Decision makers need to be able to trust and listen to the people of God. And the latter, that's the people of God, need in turn to be able to trust those in authority. And of course, sometimes they don't. Well, they don't trust the politicians either, as we know, but anyhow, they don't trust the bishops. Several paragraphs offer guidance on the principles and processes of ecclesial discernment and highlights the need for a special formation for those in leadership, as well as for the facilitators who will play a vital role in helping to bring about the process of discernment and decision-making. Ecclesial discernment, the document states, is, and this is an important point, is not an organizational technique, but rather a spiritual practice grounded in living faith. It is never just a setting out of one's own personal or group point of view, or a summing up of different individual opinions. Now, I think this is an important point, because I get the impression from reading Mary McAleese, to come back to her, that she thinks that this kind of an assembly of bishops is all about people taking stances on different issues, bringing them together, debating them, and one side winning over the other. That is not what happens. Noting that those who exercise authority in the church must do so in consultation with others, the document calls for a revision of canon law to clarify the distinction between deliberation and consultation, between those who make the decision ultimately and the process before it of consulting people. There are several paragraphs on key issues of church governance, such as transparency, accountability, and evaluation, and on synodality and participatory bodies like within the church, such as diocesan synods, parish pastoral councils, which we have here in Blackrock Road and in Wilton, and presbyterial councils, and indeed there are many more, but those are mentioned. The document recognizes that the effective vitality of these bodies, synodal bodies, requires them to be mandatory, not optional. In other words, it's not left up to the parish priest, whether he's crazy or not, to decide to have a council. They must be, as well as mandatory, they must be efficient and effective. Now, sometimes the reason they're not either efficient or effective is because those involved in them have not been formed to know how to participate or to know anything about what a synodal process is. Now, part 4 of the document is called An Abundant Catch, and it looks at the issue of the conversion of bonds, the bonds of unity in the church. And here the document focuses on the need to create new bonds, new ways of uniting the church at local, regional, and universal levels. The opening paragraph states, and I quote, "In a time when there is a great change occurring in the places where the church is rooted and on pilgrimage, we need to cultivate new forms of the exchange of gifts and a network of bonds that unites us." In other words, the old ways aren't enough, really. The document notes the implications for the church of rapid urbanization and migration, as well as what it calls the existential peripheries of rural areas and places of marginalization and exclusion. It highlights the potential of the digital revolution to be a prophetic space for proclamation and mission, and asks the local churches to encourage, sustain, and accompany those engaged in this area of mission. The document insists on the importance of reaching out to marginalized groups. Well, that would be certainly the spirit of Pope Francis. And it calls for the creation of a more open and hospitable church in the new context of mobility and interconnectedness. And without offering specific suggestions, the document recommends that parishes be reconfigured. You'll have to ask John Denver what that means, so that they focus on mission and outreach and on Christian initiation, accompaniment, and formation. Part 5 also highlights the importance of ecclesial bodies, such as bishops' conferences and other ecclesial assemblies at regional, national, and intercontinental levels, and calls for them to be strengthened. It calls for a special council around the Pope of patriarchs and archbishops of the Eastern Catholic Churches, while recommending the implementation of a sound decentralization in accordance with the teaching of Pope Francis in The Joy of the Gospel. It notes the need for clarification regarding those matters which can be left to bishops and those reserved to the Pope. Under Pope John Paul II, many more things tended to be referred to Rome that could have been dealt with by bishops. Francis was against that centralization. The document also calls for the dicasteries of the Roman Curia. There are quite a number of them, as you know, when publishing important documents, to consult episcopal conferences beforehand. In other words, not to be high and mighty and to just let these documents descend on them without any consultation taking place. Finally, it recommends that future synods of bishops continue to include lay people as well as religious. And I presume with voting rights, although they didn't say that. Now, the final part is on formation for mission. So I send you is the title of it. The focus here is on formation for missionary discipleship. The document states that one of the requests that emerged very strongly during all stages and contexts of the synodal consultation process is that the formation provided by the Christian community, now that's who it says provided, the Christian community, be integral and continuing, and also that it be common and shared. That is, involving men as well as women, clerics as well as laity. So this kind of separation of clerical and laity, they're trying to cut that down. So these would have to participate together in the formation programs. As was emphasized in the report on the first session of the Roman Synod, This document calls for a complete overhaul of seminary formation, involving women as formators as well as men. I remember when we tried to bring in women in Bonga in the 1980s, it was, when I was there and Jerry was there at the time. We were told very quickly that women were not allowed to be involved with seminarians or to be teaching them or to be doing anything with them at all. So they have to be included now. The church has done quite an about turn on that. The document also calls on the church to strengthen its commitment to promoting in all ecclesial contexts a culture of safeguarding, making communities ever safer places for minors and vulnerable persons by offering specific and ongoing formation and training for those working with minors and vulnerable adults. Now, the church has still somewhere way to go in that respect. And synodality will make the church more open and transparent if it is implemented, and will be hopefully a lot less criticism, a lot less tendency to be secretive, and to keep things from laity, to keep things from those who should know. Finally, the document highlights the need for ongoing formation regarding the social teaching of the church, its commitment to justice and peace, care for our common home, and intercultural and interreligious dialogue. And this formation must be more widely shared among the people of God. Now we've come to the end of the 5 parts. So I just want a few words of, evaluation and conclusion. At first sight, the final document of the Synod on Synodality seems neither revolutionary nor prophetic. It's long and wordy, and in no way matches the freshness and visionary thrust of the Vatican II documents. No, these are solely my own opinions. You may not agree with them. Mary McAleese's evaluation is quite disparaging. She describes the Synod document as one big wordy yawn signifying absolutely nothing. But I didn't see you yawning here as I was presenting it, so it's not as bad maybe as she said. On the other hand, Father Jerry O'Hanlon's evaluation is more positive. You know Jerry O'Hanlon, I hope. Oh, he's a Jesuit priest. He's taught. Yes, he was. Correct, Jerry. Well done. Well done. I knew him when he was provincial, and he was also a lecturer, and he's a fine theologian. But he describes the Synod document as hopeful and, I quote his words, a blueprint for change. While many people were disappointed that the Synod did not come up with more radical proposals for the renewal of the church and its structures, it did open avenues for change, even including the possibility of a diaconate for women, as I've said already, and the renewal of the church at every level. The degree of consensus achieved by the participants was indeed remarkable, given the great diversity of viewpoints represented in the Synodal Assembly. If we took a similar number of politicians from all around the world, how much agreement or consensus would we achieve? Many participants have described it as, and I have examples, I've come across a number of them, as a personal conversion experience for them. They said that's what it was. However, the success of the Synod must not be judged solely by the final document. The Synodal Assembly was itself an exercise in synodality, an experience that left an indelible impression on its participants. The method adopted by the Synod, Conversations in the Spirit, helped to create an atmosphere of deep and respectful listening and enhanced the sense of community among the participants. with those coming from very different places in the world and with very different views about the church and its mission. The ultimate aim of the synodal process, as Pope Francis has always insisted, is not to make the church into a more democratic institution, but to enable the church as the people of God to walk and work together in the service of the mission entrusted to it by the Lord. As the Pope said in his concluding homily, the Synod on Synodality showed that it is possible for people of very different backgrounds and with very different viewpoints to walk together in harmony despite differences. And this was the success of the Synod on Synodality, and its witness is a much needed antidote to the hatred, violence, and interminable conflicts that mark the world of our time. Amen.